The sky above Italy was burning. American bombers stretched across the horizon like silver arrows cutting through the sun, their engines droning in steady rhythm. Below them, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, flew their sleek P-51 Mustangs, their crimson-painted tails glinting in the light. They had been underestimated by nearly everyone, mocked by enemy pilots, doubted by their own commanders, and dismissed by a nation still bound by segregation. Yet on this day, they flew with a quiet, unshakable purpose. Back home in Tuskegee, Alabama, they had been called dreamers. The idea of training black pilots in 1941 was met with ridicule. Many in Washington believed African Americans lacked the intelligence or courage for combat. But the men who arrived at Tuskegee Institute came to prove them wrong. They studied aerodynamics by day and faced prejudice by night. They were told they would fail, and they simply refused to. Under the sweltering southern sun, they marched, trained, and flew until excellence was their only answer. Their leader, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., carried himself with iron discipline. The son of the U.S. Army's first black general, he knew that every mistake, every failure, would not just be his own. It would be ammunition for those who believed men like him didn't belong in the cockpit. He demanded perfection. No excuses. The eyes of the nation are upon you, he told his men. Don't give them a reason to doubt. When the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in Europe, the veterans of the Luftwaffe laughed. To them, the idea of black pilots flying advanced fighters was absurd. German intelligence even mocked them in broadcasts, calling them Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. But the laughter ended quickly. On July 2, 1943, Lieutenant Charles B. Hall of the 99th Fighter Squadron spotted an enemy Focke-Wulf 190 cutting across the formation. He dived, fired a burst from his machine guns, and watched the German fighter burst into flames. It was the first aerial victory by a black American pilot, and the first crack in the wall of disbelief that surrounded them. News of the kill spread quickly. Hall's victory wasn't just a triumph in the air. It was a statement to the world. By 1944, the Red Tails had earned a new kind of reputation. They became the most reliable bomber escorts in the U.S. Army Air Forces. While other groups broke formation to chase kills, the Tuskegee pilots stayed with their bombers, no matter the cost. The crews they protected began to request them by name. "If you see Red Tails, you'll make it home," one bomber pilot said. Their missions took them deep into the heart of Nazi territory, Vienna, Munich, Berlin, where the skies swarmed with German fighters. The Luftwaffe aces, veterans with dozens of kills, were eager to face these experiment pilots. They would not be so eager after what came next. The Red Tails fought with precision and calm. They learned to anticipate German maneuvers, to strike fast and vanish into the clouds. In one engagement, Captain Roscoe Brown and his squadron encountered Germany's latest terror weapon, the jet-powered Me-262. Faster, deadlier, seemingly untouchable. But Brown led his men in perfect formation, predicting the jet's dive pattern. When the Me-262s broke through the bomber stream, the Red Tails were waiting. In a matter of minutes, 3 German jets were destroyed. The Luftwaffe stopped laughing. But their battles weren't only fought in the air. On the ground, the Tuskegee Airmen faced a different kind of enemy, discrimination from the very country they served. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate respect. Even after returning from missions that risked their lives, they were often treated as less than equals by white officers. Yet they carried themselves with quiet dignity. "Our country may not always love us," one pilot said, "but we love our country enough to fight for it anyway." That was the heart of their strength, discipline, pride, and unity. When one pilot was shot down, others risked their lives to protect him. When a bomber was in trouble, they stayed close, guiding it home. And when critics back in the United States claimed their success was exaggerated, the numbers spoke louder than any opinion. Their bomber loss rate, just 27 aircraft, was among the lowest of any escort group in the war. To the men in those bombers, the Red Tails were heroes. Those Red Tails were angels, one recalled decades later. They never left us. As the war neared its end, their legend spread even among their enemies. German pilots began to recognize the red-painted tails and knew what it meant: skilled, relentless opposition. Even those who survived encounters with them often admitted respect. One German ace reportedly said, "They are better than most of the Americans we fight. They never break formation." The Tuskegee Airmen proved more than their courage. They redefined excellence itself. Against every barrier, they rose, not with anger, but with mastery. Every victory was an answer to hatred. Every escort mission, a lesson in integrity. They showed the world that equality was not granted. It was earned, proven, and defended in the hardest of places. By the end of the war, 992 pilots had graduated from the Tuskegee program. 50 had deployed overseas. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft, damaged hundreds more, and earned 96 distinguished flying crosses. But perhaps their greatest victory was invisible, a blow not against Germany, but against the myth of racial inferiority. When the Red Tails returned home, the parades were smaller than they deserved. The same segregation that had followed them overseas waited for them still. But the change had begun. The U.S. military could no longer deny the truth their service had proven. Within 3 years, President Truman would sign Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. The Tuskegee Airmen had not only defended freedom, they had expanded it. In the years that followed, many of them became educators, officers, engineers, and community leaders. Their discipline, their integrity, and their humility inspired generations. They had flown not just for victory, but for possibility, the idea that courage could break any chain. And somewhere in the black and white photographs of history, you can still see them standing beside their gleaming Mustangs, helmets under their arms, faces calm and steady, the red tails gleaming behind them. They were once mocked as the Black Birdmen, but in the end, they became something greater, the embodiment of what America could be when it lived up to its own ideals. Their story is not just one of war, but of redemption, the redemption of a nation through the valor of men it once tried to exclude. They flew so others could rise, and in every sky they touched, they left behind not just contrails, but proof that dignity can soar higher than prejudice ever will. They called them an experiment, a gamble the military didn't expect to succeed. Yet by 1944, that experiment had become one of the most respected fighter units in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. The Red Tails were no longer a curiosity. They were a legend written in smoke and flame across the skies of Europe. At Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group lived between two worlds. Their days were filled with the rhythm of war, briefings at dawn, missions by midday, silence by dusk. But beyond the perimeter fence, segregation still defined their lives. The same men who risked their lives protecting bomber crews weren't allowed to eat in the same mess halls as white officers. They weren't invited to the same dances. Letters from home spoke of discrimination, of families struggling under Jim Crow laws. And yet, despite the injustice, their focus never wavered. Each morning, the roar of engines filled the air as P-51 Mustangs lined the runway. Ground crews, many of them black mechanics and technicians, worked tirelessly to keep the aircraft battle-ready. The red-painted tails gleamed under the Italian sun, freshly polished before each mission. It was more than decoration, it was identity. Those crimson fins told every enemy in the sky exactly who they were. They didn't hide behind camouflage. They stood out proudly. "Let them see us coming," one pilot said. "They'll know who to fear." And the Germans did. Reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots described the Rot Schwans, the Red Tails, with a mix of frustration and respect. They noted their discipline, their refusal to abandon formation, their uncanny ability to appear at the right place and time. For every insult hurled at them, the Red Tails answered with precision gunfire and unbroken resolve. Their missions were grueling. Escorting bombers across the Alps meant hours of tension, freezing temperatures, oxygen masks that iced over, and the ever-present fear of ambush. The bomber crews they protected often couldn't see them, but they knew they were there. The red tails flew higher, scanning for the glint of enemy aircraft, always ready to dive in defense. When German fighters appeared, the sky erupted into chaos. Contrails twisting, tracers streaking, engines roaring. In those moments, there was no time to think about race, politics, or headlines. There was only instinct. Split-second decisions meant life or death. And again, the red tails proved they belonged among the best. Captain Charles A. Train, Dryden later recalled one such mission. We were outnumbered, but we held formation. We covered the bombers. We covered each other. That's what we did. Nobody panicked. We were professionals, and that made all the difference. They didn't fight for medals, though they earned many. They fought to be seen, to be recognized as equals in a world that still refused to see them clearly. And slowly, the evidence became undeniable. Back in Washington, officers reviewing mission reports began to take notice. Bomber groups under red tail protection returned with fewer losses. Their record was not an anomaly, it was consistency. They were the kind of unit every commander wished for. Dependable, disciplined, deadly. By the winter of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group was assigned some of the most dangerous missions of the war, deep escort runs into the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Their Mustangs cut through hostile skies where flak and fighters waited in ambush. And every time, they returned with their formation intact. In March 1945, one of their greatest tests arrived. Intelligence reported that German jet squadrons were preparing to attack Allied bombers near Berlin. The Me-262, sleek, fast, unstoppable, was Hitler's last hope to regain air superiority. When the jets appeared, the red tails were already climbing. Captain Roscoe Brown spotted the first one, dove from above, and opened fire. The jet exploded in midair. Within minutes, two more followed. 3 Me-262s destroyed in a single day, a record no one expected from the experiment out of Tuskegee. For the bomber crews, the sight of those red tails cutting through the sky was pure reassurance. Many of them didn't know who the pilots were, only that they never left. Later, when they discovered their protectors were black, some were shocked. Others were ashamed, but all were grateful. After the war, many of those same bomber pilots would become lifelong advocates for the men who saved them. They never ran, one veteran said. When the sky was full of Germans and everything went to hell, the red tails stayed. They were the best we had. But the victory in the air was only half the battle. On the ground, the fight for recognition continued. The Tuskegee Airmen's achievements were often downplayed, their heroism diluted by bias. Reports were rewritten, statistics questioned, credit misplaced. Yet the truth had wings, and it could not be buried forever. General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. stood before military leaders after the war and made his case with quiet, unflinching authority. "We have fought for our country," he said, "and we have proved our worth in combat." The record speaks for itself. What remains is for America to listen. It took time, but America did listen. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. It was a moment of justice born from their sacrifice, a recognition that valor knows no color. The Tuskegee Airmen had not only defended freedom abroad, they had expanded it at home. In the years that followed, many of them continued to serve in Korea, in Vietnam, in the halls of government and education. They became mentors, instructors, trailblazers. Some flew commercial airliners, opening doors that had once been sealed shut. Others became teachers, passing on lessons of resilience and pride. Their legacy stretched far beyond their missions. They inspired the civil rights movement that would soon sweep across the nation. Young black men and women, hearing their story, realized that excellence was the most powerful answer to prejudice. "They made me believe," one student said decades later. "If they could fly, I could dream." And as time passed, the world began to remember them properly. Museums were built, streets named, movies made. The once-forgotten experiment became a cornerstone of American history. proof that courage could reshape a nation's conscience. In interviews late in life, the surviving airmen spoke with humility. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," said Colonel Charles McGee. "We were just doing our job. But if our job helped change things, well, that makes it worth it." They lived long enough to see the world they helped create, one where young pilots of every color trained together under one flag. At air shows, children point to gleaming red-tailed Mustangs and ask about the men who flew them. And in those moments, the spirit of the Red Tails lives on, not as a chapter of history, but as a living inheritance of courage. Their story reminds us that history's greatest battles are not always fought with guns or planes, but with perseverance, the refusal to accept the limits imposed by others. When the Red Tails took to the sky, they didn't just protect bombers. They protected the idea of equality itself. They showed that excellence can silence hate, that unity can outfly division, and that dignity, once earned, cannot be denied. The Luftwaffe pilots who once mocked them were left with nothing but disbelief. They had underestimated not just their skill, but their purpose. The Red Tails didn't fly for glory. They flew for respect for their country and for every generation that would follow. And in that, they achieved what no enemy could destroy. Even now, when you see a red tail glinting against the clouds, it's more than just paint. It's a signature, written by men who refuse to be grounded, who turned the insult of experiment into a symbol of triumph. They proved that the color of a man's skin could never define the height of his flight. And though time has carried them from the skies, the sound of their engines still echoes, not in the roar of warplanes, but in the quiet confidence of a nation that finally learned to see them for what they always were, heroes. Years passed, but the skies they once ruled never forgot their wings. The world moved forward. New wars, new machines, new generations. But the legacy of the Red Tails remained like contrails across time, faint yet enduring. In quiet towns across America, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen lived ordinary lives. They became fathers, grandfathers, mechanics, teachers. Many carried their memories silently. The smell of oil, the cold of altitude, the faces of friends who never came home. They rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of duty. When the world finally began to remember them, they were old men in crisp uniforms, standing tall despite the weight of years. Medals were pinned to their chests. Crowds cheered, but their eyes, those same eyes that had once scanned the sky for enemies, carried something deeper, a quiet satisfaction that justice had finally caught up to history. At one ceremony, a reporter asked an aging pilot how it felt to be recognized after all these years. He smiled gently and said, "It feels good, but we didn't do it for that. We did it because it was right." That was their secret all along, not anger, not bitterness, but belief. They believed in a country that had not yet believed in them. They fought for freedom even when freedom denied them a seat at the table. And by doing so, they forced that table to grow larger, until one day, it finally had room for everyone. In 2007, when the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were invited to Washington to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, they stood before a generation that could barely comprehend what they had endured. Presidents, generals, and citizens rose to their feet as the men in red caps took the stage. Some leaned on canes. Others needed help to stand. But when the applause thundered through the hall, it wasn't just for them. It was for every battle fought in silence. Every door opened through sacrifice. And then, in 2009, something unimaginable happened. A black man became president of the United States. At the inauguration, several of the Tuskegee Airmen were seated as honored guests. As they watched the oath being sworn, tears fell freely. One pilot whispered to another, "Looks like we finally won, after all." It wasn't about politics. It was about fulfillment, a moment when the dream they had carried through fire and flak finally touched the ground. But their true victory was never measured in medals or history books. It lived in the countless lives they changed, in the young cadet who saw their picture in a museum and decided to fly, in a teacher who told their story to remind her students that courage has no color, in every person who refuses to let prejudice write the final draft of destiny. Today, their planes rest in museums, their uniforms preserved behind glass. Yet if you close your eyes near one of those old P-51 Mustangs, you can almost hear them. The hum of the propeller, the heartbeat of defiance. The red tails are still flying, not above Europe, but through the conscience of a nation that finally learned from their example. Their story is not just about war, it's about transformation. It's about how, in the ugliest of times, men found a way to rise higher than hate. Because when you climb into a cockpit at 20,000 feet, skin color disappears. The only thing that matters is courage, and they had it in endless supply. So, when the world remembers World War II, it should remember more than battles and victories. It should remember the men who fought 2 wars at once, one against the enemy abroad, and one against the injustice at home. And it should remember which one was harder to win. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just change the outcome of missions. They changed the course of history. They showed that equality isn't granted. It's earned through excellence, sacrifice, and the refusal to give up. And in the final measure of time, they proved something extraordinary. That even in a world built to keep them grounded, they learned to fly. The wind has long carried away the roar of their engines, but their story still whispers through the clouds, a reminder that courage can rewrite destiny, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the human heart. Because the Red Tails did more than protect bombers. They protected a dream and made it real. Years after the war, the skies they once patrolled turned peaceful again. But their legacy, it never landed. It kept flying, invisible but indestructible. In every American cockpit, in every Air Force academy, in every pilot who dares to dream, a piece of the Red Tails still lives. Their courage became part of the nation's bloodstream. Their names, once dismissed or forgotten, are now carved into the history they helped to rewrite. Charles McGee, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Lee Archer, Luther Smith, Roscoe Brown. These weren't just pilots. They were pioneers who broke through more than clouds. They broke through barriers built by centuries of doubt. Today, when a new generation steps into a flight simulator, they do so because those men refuse to accept limits. When a young woman of color receives her pilot wings, when a cadet salutes the red tail insignia on a museum wall, they are touching the echoes of that defiance. Their P-51 Mustangs are silent now, but their message still roars louder than ever. Excellence is the only color that matters. It's written in every contrail streaking across the sky, every salute raised in respect, every story told to remind us that progress was bought, not given. They didn't just win air battles over Europe. They won something far greater, the right for every future pilot to rise without asking permission. And if you listen closely, on a quiet evening when the sun dips low and the sky burns red, you might still hear it, that distant hum, that echo of wings slicing through the clouds. The Red Tails returning home, not as forgotten heroes, but as eternal symbols of what America can become when courage finally outruns prejudice. Because long after their last mission was flown, their greatest flight began, the one that carried all of us closer to equality, closer to justice, closer to the sky they made possible. And so, as the world looks up, it no longer sees just clouds or light. It sees a reminder that freedom's truest guardians don't always wear capes or crowns. Sometimes they just paint their tails red and change the world forever.